So I love this idea of a state of exception. I wonder. I don't know that it's a great idea. I don't know that one needs totalitarianism to bring it in. A state of exception is something states do all the time. We're just seeing a war in Ukraine. Putin is using the state of exception in extraordinary ways, not in the same violent ways as China or Soviet Union did. It's a great explanation for 1930s Soviet Union as well. There's all these great historiographical debate parallels between China and the Soviet Union, so this really spoke to me in many ways. So that's a great idea. I don't know that one needs the whole, one can get at it from a Hannah Arendt, but it strikes me that it's not necessarily something that only happens with totalitarianism or any of that. It is interesting how Arendt gets at this idea of structurelessness for me. The first thing she does is to pivot away from any idea of these regimes as having any material basis. They neglect, quote, material and economic interests, deny profit motives, and pursue non-utilitarian goals. In other words, they have no political economy. They're structureless. And the first thing that she needs to do is to kill any idea that there's any kind of logic that's structuring, say, the governance of the hundreds of factories that are being built, the governance of agricultural production, the governance of economic life that actually exists, right? And so it's very striking for me that that's what she needs to do away with, to deny. And it's also, in the Soviet case, very wrong. It's absolutely 100% wrong. There is material incentives from the get-go. There is, when you go to the Soviet archives, this is something that has always struck me about Soviet historiography. No one really writes about economic history of the Soviet Union very much, since the economists did it in the 70s and 80s. When you go to the Soviet archives, 70% of the archives are economic management. And maybe 30% are, propaganda, healthcare system, education system or something. But mostly what the state is engaged in is economics management, and they have to structure that. Now, in the Chinese case, slightly different, because as you say, there are these cycles, there are restructuring constantly up until at least the early 70s. I've seen great work lately that talks about the early 70s seeding a lot of the post-78 stuff. But what happens, so my question, I guess, would be, my selfish question would be, is it possible to deny political economy when thinking about these issues and thinking about China in its totality? How might we understand political economy in a Chinese situation? Is it a secondary category of historical analysis? And what happens to these notions of totalitarianism or just structurelessness if we include political economy in the analysis?
No, this is a great question, and I think why I went back to this, and of course I don't want to go into the question of whether that is correct for the Soviet Union, but what I wanted to do is trying to explain why these regimes, when confronted with the question of the priority of, let's say, what you called political economy, or let's say economic interests, or let's say economic priorities, or political priorities. And of course that was something that we have always thought here or wished for, that then the regimes would of course vote for economic rationality and would not put political interest above economic rationality. But I think, at least in the case of China, we have seen this a couple of times, right? That when faced with the question whether or not the revolutionary regime needs to be defended to stay in power, it would vote for maintaining or defending power over economic interests. Ultimately, right? Not every day. So you are absolutely right. When there is not, let's say, when we do not have a situation where a decision needs to be made, when political power is not in danger, when when so to say the hold on power and the society is secure, I think the pursuit of economic interest is okay. And I think you're absolutely right that this is something that Hannah Arendt makes not that clear and perhaps overlooks, right? But I thought that is a way, you know, even if not in this absolutistic way that Hannah Arendt put it, that's something to explain, you know, certain phenomena or, in Chinese history, PRC history. And well, I mean, with the totalitarianism, I'm totally with you, right? So we don't. I was just, you know, for me, I thought when reading Hannah Arendt, which I did as an undergrad, and I thought there is something in there, as you know, because she was very close to these things, and Hannah Arendt has become since then actually very popular, right? But not her book, not the totalitarian book, interestingly, but still she was very close, and she was a very acute observer of these phenomena. So I think there's something to learn from. But I'm with you. I wouldn't buy it the whole thing, right?
Thank you for both talks. Let me just ask a question that tries to bridge the two, and recover the status of exception idea as necessary. Schmidt is writing The Rise of the Third Reich and Political Theology. He's saying the sovereign is the one who decides the state of exception, right? And it's about totalitarianism, but it's also about the League of Nations, right? It's about the United States and Britain kind of like surveying these confederations of regulation that the Third Reich is reacting to through Carl Schmitt in part, right? And then you get to the nomos of the earth, and it picks up this idea of maritime powers, right? And the Leviathan is Schmitt's kind of central, like a super sign of this kind of power, this sovereignty, right? And then you get to, let's leave Schmitt and the state of exception aside and go to like the longue durée, the Annales historians who are looking from the Mediterranean trading circuitry, and then thinking about projecting that power into the New World, right? And Schmitt begins the state of exception with 1492, the discovery. So it's not so much slavery, that's kind of even in Pomerantz, it's slavery alongside this Atlantic traffic and extraction of resources from the New World, right? Now, if we go then to Professor Ma's talk, my question is, how does this distinction between nomadic and agrarian empire feature the maritime powers, let's say, of the Ming or Zhenghe, right? And in the Ming, like, that's when the maritime powers are basically abandoned, right? And yet, the maritime powers of, let's say, the Yuan dynasty, like, were amazing. Like, it was almost a Spanish Armada moment into Japan, to use a false analogy, but but also into Java, right? This kind of Yuan force that's going, and then Zhenghe, like, if you read Amitav Ghosh's novels, like, there you have the blueprint of real power, state power projecting itself in a maritime way that I don't know if it's agrarian or nomadic in your paradigm, but I do think it's central to notions of state governance and power and sovereignty, which is not just holding it, but projecting it across a field of fuzzy yi, right?
Let's pick up the questions first.
I really enjoy both presentations. Both are great. What do we mean by China and Chineseness, right? Because you talk about rethinking of China under Mao. I mean, Debin's about actually the big vision of China. My question, let's start with Mao first. Then actually that apply to your presentation. Because Mao, in 1920s, early 1920s, he basically challenged the whole idea of China. See, the idea of China was fake. He strongly advocated the Hunan independence. They say Hunan represent real China. That all the ideas represented in 24th century, 24 so-called dynasty official histories was fake, right? So that basically brings us the question, I think that for both of us, my question is, what do we mean by China? See, Because when you talk about the idea of China, you literally take China for granted, right? If basically, say you mentioned about 华夷之变, either the change between Chineseness and barbarian, or the discussion or debate about this. So for Hunan's people, used to be Man, barbarian, right? So now basically you say, another thing, of course, when we think about Chineseness, or basically you talk about others, 葛剑顺's idea, that's made, so even in China, they start to discuss what do we mean by China? Because they're basically based on Confucian ideas. So I think basically when we think about China, many of us took China for granted, or basically static. But really we mean China for many perspectives is changing. For example, if we, from Koreans' perspective, Korean argued after the Manchus came to power, right? They say they were really China. Even some Japanese say, if you from the Confucian ideas of China, Japanese preserve more Chineseness than we are, right? That's of course from Klaus' paper. For most China, that's totally different China. That's socialism, Marxism. It's from your country, not right? That's not traditional China. So also more basically, fundamentally, as I mentioned, if we took 1920s Mao's idea, challenge his idea of later Mao for China, that's basically contradictory, right? So that's basically the question I will ask now for both of you. What do you think, how we define China from, say, broader perspective? Because just give you one example, recently there's one American scholar wrote a book, American History, from perspective of native Americans, how from Indians' perspective, United States should be. So now from our perspective, so now since this we talk about new frontiers, new directions, how we approach China from so-called real perspective.
Okay. Now let me ask 3 quick questions from a native Hunanese perspective.
Okay, yeah, of course.
So I'm a native Hunanese, so I will ask from a southern barbarian perspective. Okay. So for Debin, a very interesting presentation. But I have 3 quick questions. One is, maybe the first one is more like a suggestion. Because there is a paper by, you also mentioned Peter Turkin, right? There is a paper by him and about 5 other co-authors published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, so PNAS, back in 2013 or 2014. They used the whole Eurasian society sample to show how large empires were formed, what were the drivers. So at the end of the day, the main conclusion, of course, is warfare. But behind warfare, many factors played a role. What you find in the end is more or less like consistent with what they find. That's one. The first question now is, you talked much about the importance of ideology for unifying China, right? But actually, in your regression exercise, you don't include any of the word counts for 统一 and so on. I mean, I assume that it's relatively easy to include that in your regressions, but probably so Chen Shuo may have found the results to be not too supportive, and then you guys dropped that out of the table. Okay. So I look for your explanation, and then lastly, because I've worked on this a lot, the kind of questions you guys try to answer, except I focus much more on the prehistoric, the Neolithic period, and the early period, early China. So before you guys stopped, that's where, before you guys begin, that's where we stop, okay. But we have come up with very different conclusions than yours, except war is the main driver. That's common, but I will explain when I talk. But on the other hand, based on the main hypothesis or conclusion that it's the nomadic war threats from the north that drove the intensity of unity in Chinese history, right, for the period you study. But actually, all the war fighting from a Hunanese perspective took place, so far away from us, right? For all these southern barbarian societies, as well as the Western barbarian societies, the threats from the nomads, those were like non-issue for us, for my ancestors. But then why would the southern regions not rebel to break away from the unified state ruled by northerners, right? So in other words, if you actually look at the territorial size of the different states at the beginning of the spring and autumn period, between 770 BC and roughly 500 BCE, over that period, the biggest territorial states were 楚国, 八国, 蜀国. They're all in the south. So actually, for my study with Peter Turkin and Wang Wanda, my student here, we first approached this from a totally different angle. My hypothesis is that, in the south, people were relatively unfamiliar with being governed with power, political power. So they did not care that much. Whoever would like to govern them, so be it. But for northerners, especially for the regions where later became the core of China, of the unified China, people there cared so much about power. So for the early spring and autumn periods, there were so many little states, small states, in the Central Plains and in the area where later the Qingguo and Jingguo were located. So I thought something else must be going on. It's not like the Central Plains and the northern China being much easier to govern. Our show, actually, that was before your period, it was the total opposite. The northern plains were much harder to defend. Anyway, something else happened. So maybe the real question I want to ask is, why did the southern regions and those societies were willing to be governed? Because presumably, whether they would want to stay with the unified state or not should not be so much determined by the nomadic threats, because the residents in those days would say, why does that have anything to do with us? Okay, anyway. So how do you explain that?
Do you have a very, very quick question?
Thank you for the two inspiring speeches. I would have a question for Professor Ma. It is, in your speech, you provided a lot of data and maps about nomadic capitals. Actually, how do you define or prove that they are nomadic capitals? Yeah, thank you.
Well, I respond to Guoti's question. What is China? This forever confusing, bewildering question. What is China? And so what I try to argue is, of course, that China gets reinvented in '49. So the China we see after revolution, and then of course not all of a sudden, but increasingly, and the China before that, that's very different. And I think since then, China gets reinvented in a transnational context. As you're absolutely right, under strong influence of a German thinker, and with strong Russian help. Okay. Yeah, and I even believe that what we can see in the 1950s, apart from, let's say, the last 20 years, but if you just look at the 1950s, that's perhaps the most systematic, largest transfer of foreign ideas, institutions, people even, right? With 10 10,000s of Russian advisors working in China in every field, even in the hinterland and so on and so forth. And I would say only after reform and opening, and perhaps only in the 1990s, you see a similar large transfer of institutions, but this time from the United States, mostly from the United States and Europe. So my whole point is to say, you know, so China gets reinvented. And if I look into a larger historical perspective, I would say China also reinvents itself at the turn of the 20th century, when it departs from the imperial model and looks for something else. Yeah.
Well, thank you all very much for the questions. I try to be quick so as make sure that we get to Ziwu's presentation and so on. Kendall's point is very well taken. China's maritime frontier is quite interesting. We all know, well, there's long literature on this. The Zhenghe is organized by state. It's heavily taxing everything. And then, of course, the whole, there was still rumor whether they were looking for what is a Jianwen Huangdi, right? So the idea that maybe there was someone else, who, you know, one of the Ming emperor that ran away. I think to a certain degree, the Zhenghe was a legacy of the Yuan dynasty, which was much more open, right? You know, I said it a little bit in the paper, I try to be quick. Here, the Yuan did not have the same kind of respect for the Chinese civilization as the earlier, you know, Wei Wendi did. I mean, they actually, you know, we mentioned in the paper, the word Yuan is given by a Chinese scholar, but it was not from any of the Zhou lineages. So all the previous dynasties, Song is coming from the Zhou, you know, lineages, Song whatever. As Yuan Mingqing forever, it was completely different. So this is, I mean, only very late on Yuan did that. But that shows a very big difference. You know, if you think about the Vastagama, those are very small scale operations done largely by a very, very fragmented estate. And they were able to explore, you know, and the efforts were sustained, unlike when Zhenghe stopped, you know, everything completely stopped. The other thing is, we know that Portugal and all the things that were active, but they were not strong enough. So that really was only by mid-19th century when the British came again, that really was a big shock when they launched the Opium War. So it's really in that brief 200 or 300 years, the West has transformed. Guoqi's point about Hunan, and yeah, you have a real, so I have great admiration for the Hunanese now, as I may have told you. You know, one of the greatest politicians I admire was Zhu Rongji, and a lot of people think he was Shanghainese, that he wasn't. He was actually, and as we all know, Mao is Hunanese as well. The thing that was quite important is the idea of Hunan being independent had its origin, probably the power came from Zheng Guofan. We all know that story about the suppression of the Taiping Rebellion. Ever since then, Zheng Guofan, Li Hongzhang dominated. Only recently, a couple of days ago, I realized, you know, Yuan Sikai and Duan Qirui, they all came from the Huaijun, those lines, right? So in the 100-day reform, they were very much inspired by the Japanese example. One of the things about Japanese example is the independent daimyo, particularly the Satsuma. So if you think about Tan Sitong and Liang Qichao, they were talking about Hunan should be the Satsuma of China. So that's where part of the idea was coming from. So this is really very interesting. Regarding the question of what is Chinese, this is quite interesting. You know, it's the first Japanese book I completely read from the beginning to end. There are several ways you could describe it. One is from cultural identity. So most Chinese will think no matter who you are, whether German or whatever, if you accept the Confucius teaching, 圣人三代, then you are Chinese. So that was a little bit Ziwu's, you know, book, the Wenming, you know, civilization. So the Chinese in that kind of civilization idea. There's ethnic identity idea. That's where Qing had really in trouble, right? There's a territorial idea. But I think it's, you know, this is a question that we were constantly struggling. I mean, let me get to Ziwu's point quickly. Yes, I was very much inspired by Peter Turchin's point. So, you know, I'm a great admirer of his work. I'm a skeptical of people doing all the careful identification we did a little bit. Even there, we didn't want to emphasize complete causality, partly because ideology, everything working all kinds of directions. We had obviously a regression from the very beginning, running the word count against the warfare. And if there's no long run fact, there's short run facts. So we had an equation, then I look at it and I talk with some econometricians, and didn't make any sense. I said, let's drop that. And part of the reason, because these word count data were measured very differently. They're using emperor's ring, so they're not exactly, timing wasn't right. So at this point, we're only laying it out as a quantification. Let me get to your final point about the reason some of the people, which I tended to believe, why China was unified, because the Northern Chinese plain and later the Lower Yangtze plain was much bigger block. So they supported a much larger army. And they were facing the nomadic threat. Because all the southern part, the agrarian part, they were slowly absorbed into the agrarian system. But the nomadic frontier can never be absorbed. I think Gejun described very well. When you go to Xinjiang, it's so far away. You know, you have the oasis, Luzhou, that was okay. But in between, you cannot settle. So it was very hard for the agrarian system, bureaucracy, repression, all these things to control. So that was forever a frontier. I do think there is no huge open plain. And the question of independence really came in. Hunan became, we all know in the warlord period, there was independent in that regard. But the big block of northern China and Lower Yangtze probably played a very big role. I mean, just as a way of, some people were asking, why was Germany and Italy were unified at the same time? But Germany was so much cohesive. And Italy, people, though, was divided, you know, people were so different, right? So one person said, well, part of Germany had a very large Prussia, and that just dominated. So maybe this is a sort of a little bit analogy in that sense. Finally, the question on the nomadic capital. Nomadic capital is very tricky because we were purposely skipping it. Thank you for asking the question. Most nomadic regimes, they have multiple capitals, right? They are much more mobile. So we skipped that, but it did show up nomadic capital, nomadic regime did not matter that much with the warfare. The reduction of nomadic regime did have any impact, was not impacted by anyway by warfare and so on. I think I better really stop.